Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. May I please ask that you all rise so that we may welcome the platform party.
Can everybody hear me? Great. Good evening. Good evening, colleagues, and students, and friends, and family. It is an exciting night here at the University of Cape Town, and I'm thrilled to have you all join us for this very special occasion. I am Professor Jeff Morgan. I'm the Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Internationalization here at UCT. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's inaugural lecture. I also bring greetings from our Vice Chancellor, Professor Mosa Mashabela, who could not be here this evening due to prior commitments. So tonight we're in for an inspiring journey as we hear from Professor Sandra Young, a renowned scholar in English literary studies from our Faculty of Humanities. A special welcome to Professor Young's family and guests. And before we dive into what promises to be an enriching evening, let me introduce the members of tonight's platform party. The Dean of Humanities at UCT, Professor Shose Kessie, who will introduce Professor Young. Professor Chris Thurman from the Department of English at the University of Witwatersrand will offer the vote of thanks. And I heard in the elevator that he is Mr. Shakespeare in South Africa. Not from him. And colleagues, due to prior commitments on my side, I will have to leave at some point during the lecture. It's not because I'm a mathematician and I find Shakespeare boring. Not at all. But there are previous commitments. And so Professor Kesse will then deliver the closing remarks at the end of the lecture tonight. So for anyone who's not familiar with this, inaugural lectures really hold a special place in the life of the university. They mark the achievement of full professorship, the highest academic rank, and a milestone that all dedicated scholars strive for. Reaching this rank is a significant recognition of the individual's academic excellence, influence, and profound impact of their work. The path to becoming a professor is demanding. There are, I see in the audience, many professors that I recognize, and you would understand and appreciate this fact. And there are rigorous criteria to meet to get here, making this accomplishment, Professor Young's accomplishment, even more valued. For UCT, these inaugural lectures are a moment of pride. They reflect the high standards of research, of teaching, and leadership that shape our institution. It is an opportunity for the university community to come together, to learn from a leading expert, and to engage with the scholarship that defines who we are as a world-class institution. As we gather for tonight's inaugural lecture, we have a unique opportunity to delve into the fascinating world of Professor Young's scholarly work. In this lecture, Professor Young will invite us to explore how literary texts, particularly Shakespeare's The Tempest, offers powerful tools for grappling with difficult histories and ongoing social injustices. Through her extensive research, Professor Young demonstrates how creative works can either reinforce the status quo or challenge systems of oppression. And she highlights how theatre has served as a space for reckoning with issues such as slavery and colonization. Her lecture will provide us with an opportunity to understand how literature, far from being an elitist pursuit, plays a crucial role in cultural practices that shape or resist power structures. By reimagining Shakespeare's works in contemporary contexts, Professor Young shows us how stories of dispossession, of struggle, and survival continue to resonate in today's world. This evening promises to deepen our understanding of the connections between literature and social justice, offering a rich exploration of how imagination helps us confront both historical and current challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, I now hand over the podium to Professor Kessie to introduce Professor Young. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I want to start by acknowledging our Vice-Chancellor in absentia, Professor Musa Mushabela, to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Jeff Morgan, to our esteemed guest, Prof Chris Thurman, colleagues, friends, and family. I have the privilege today of introducing Professor Sandra Young, and this task is made difficult by Professor Young's consistent sheer brilliance over decades. For most people, it is easier to talk about milestones as key markers in their careers, but for Professor Young, the challenge is to speak briefly about an entire career that is in itself a milestone. Early observations from her teachers into her career as a student in the early 1990s already demonstrate an extremely gifted student in her unusual capacity for close, critical reading and critical thought, with her areas of specialization already charted. Her master's degree focused on South African women's prison narratives and TRC testimonies, engaging with trauma studies, conceptualizations of memory, and the problematics of archives and representation. I mention this because this is work that Professor Young has continued to work on consistently over decades since her MA, which once again echoes the sentiments from earlier of her unusual capacity for close application to critical thought consistently over decades. Her inaugural lecture tonight as a full professor is intensely connected to her work as a university student. Her commitment to social justice underwrites her reading of the classical texts that she has revisited, reread, and compels us all to reread from the perspective of the Global South. The invocation of Saidiya Hartman in her inaugural lecture tonight is connected to the difficulties of representation in writing out of unjust systems in the metamorphized nature of what Hartman calls the afterlives. Tonight we will be treated to a brilliant lecture that will weave through critical fabulation of those repressed under social injustice, but also through a rare reading of the uses and abuses of Shakespeare's work through partisan and interested reading. Professor Young's courage as a scholar is in her steadfast resolve to stand firm and call us to a close reading of Shakespeare to expose these interested dominant readings that have led to some profound misreadings. She does this through painstaking engagement with archival material, which breaks and liberates Shakespeare and allows for perspectives from the global South to reimagine our relationship with Shakespeare as a canonical figure and to find resonance from unusual vantage points. This intersection of the historical and the imaginative in Professor Young's work is at the core of what makes her distinguishable from most, and for us at the University of Cape Town to have a scholar of her international stature is something we are deeply proud of. Here at the University of Cape Town, we have also known Professor Young for dedicated service to the life of this university broadly, to her students and colleagues in particular. Both students and colleagues testified to the integrity of her character as a mentor to younger students and as a competent and fair administrator during her term as head of department. She steered the ship through rough waves of the Rosemus Fall student movement, which forcefully posed tough questions to all of our fields and the meaning of decolonization in our work. Professor Young's personal work anticipated this call, as she has and still calls on her field to re-examine itself in its representation of race, gender, and class. Professor Young's commitment to her literary work literally translated to the transformation in her department under her leadership that saw the strategic hiring of several Black women and adjusting the department to new epistemological and cultural trajectories while keeping what's valuable of institutional culture and transforming what needed to be transformed. This is what you call visionary leadership. This is not someone who was forced to change with the times. This was someone who was working for change to catch up with her. Her greatest impact in global Shakespeare studies has shaken the world in the area of literary studies. Her books are awaited with great anticipation for their shape-shifting impact already seen in her field-changing articles published in top journals. She is a leading scholar in her field with leadership in professional bodies, most notably as the Vice President of the Shakespeare Society of South Africa. While abroad, she serves in editorial boards of several high-impact journals. Her theoretically incisive, innovative, and bold scholarship is admired by scholars across ranks. Her ability to critically engage with the archive intimately while attending to its challenges is also deeply admired, making her truly unique in navigating the terrains of transnational solidarities in a world and at a time where so much divides us. Professor Young is internationally a well-sought-after keynote speaker in conferences, an organizer of key seminars, and as it is befitting her stature as a scholar, Professor Young recently organized a challenging but successful conference on Shakespeare and social justice. While we are rightfully impressed in higher education by all of her achievements, her commitment transcends to pupils still at school and early investment beyond her official call of duty, and needless to say, theatre makers across the world engage her work to reimagine Shakespeare for the stage for new generations. There are few distinguished scholars in any field that are this deeply connected with the centuries past of their field, while intensely engaged with its present concerns and immensely shaping its future. This is the full cycle and total package of scholarly achievement, and we are proud as an institution to have been your home throughout this journey. As we bring you on stage, Professor Young, I especially want to thank your family for gifting us such a treasure in you. Thank you very much, and welcome to the stage.
I feel quite overwhelmed at having my work represented in that way. So let me just start by saying grateful thanks, Dean Casey, and to all of you gathered here. BBC Morgan, my honoured colleague, Chris Thurman, who in fact co-hosted that conference on Shakespeare and social justice. So lovely to have you here. Colleagues, friends, students, my beautiful family, my dad. I'm so glad that you are here, and I would like to dedicate this lecture to my parents. My kind and beautiful mum, who passed away 30 years ago, and so far too soon, has not had a sense of this, really. I think about it often and miss her terribly, and I'm so thrilled to have my father, my beautiful, loving father here, my brother, my family, and all of you. Thank you. And those who are listening in from afar, or who will be listening in later when they can, thank you. This is a true honor, because it gives me an opportunity to tell you about the work that I have found so incredibly rewarding to do, and just such a privilege as a scholar of the literary imagination, and also the textual forms that literature takes, in thinking about the way that the world making that they do, for better and for worse, and the possibility that we have as readers and thinkers and those of us, all of us, tasked, who are equipped with the imagination, to be able to imagine a more just world, and to do that very careful work of pulling apart the smoke and mirrors that has led to language systems in which the powerful hold sway and the vulnerable are disempowered. And I feel that the figure of Shakespeare has tended to be aligned with the interests of, with sort of ideas of elevated culture and so on. And there's a big history that has led to that. The fact that he was an export along with colonialism, quite explicitly, in the years after his life. But the thing is that Shakespeare has traveled all the way around the world and been taken up in contexts that he himself could not have imagined, and worked with and messed with and hijacked, in a way, as some scholars have said. He's been reimagined by people who have called him ours, and as a result has been renewed, but also been invited into conversations about injustice. And it's the work of innovative contemporary theatre makers who have reimagined, who've invited Shakespeare into that conversation and created new pathways for thought and imagination. And so that's part of the story that I would like to tell today. I'd like to start with an anecdote that gives a sense of where I'm headed with this, because soon after that terrible COVID lockdown, where we were all stuck in our spaces, and the laws allowed us to go beyond municipal boundaries, I was lucky enough to be taken by my son and husband into the mountains, into wild spaces, and we knew that on the last day the weather was going to come in, and we would probably be stuck in a cave. The thing is that if you're stuck in the cave with a independently minded teenager who finds maths delicious, but not necessarily Shakespeare, and we have time to be in conversation, chances are questions might be raised, and as they were, why Shakespeare and social justice? I mean, I get the social justice part, he said, but why should governments fund research, use good money, limited resources to fund research into Shakespeare and social justice? And so we spent an interesting day thinking through, and I feel that I didn't do justice to what is an entirely reasonable question. And so I'm hoping that part of my lecture today will at least give a sense of how I've come to the kinds of questions that I've tried to raise in my work. My daughter suggested that it would be really helpful to just start with a slide that gives you a sense of the areas of my research, so that before I get into the detail, and so that's what this is for, just to give you a sense that a big part of the work that I've done has been examining print culture in early modernity, so the 16th and 17th century, looking at the scholarly texts, the maps, the geographies, and so on. In a sense, trying to do a sort of history of science, if you like, because in the 16th century, there was this explosion of new ideas, of knowledge, and this anxiety about the fact that with the so-called discovery, Europe's so-called discovery of worlds that they had not even known about, that their forefathers, that Aristotle and the boys and the ivory towers had no idea existed. And so a tremendous amount of attention being given to how they could signal that these new discoveries were reliable and could be demonstrably shown to be reliable knowledge. And so, but of course, with those texts came deeply partisan discourses that set up a hierarchy between the world of the North and the world of the South. And so a big part of what I've been working on in this very delicious archival material, just uncovering how some of these ideas became entrenched in early modern knowledge systems, which has cast its shadow over what we think we know as truth today. Then there's a large body of my work that has looked at how the world from which Shakespeare's work emerged, and my second book was about that, but really about how Shakespeare has been taken up today, and so a large part of my talk will focus on that. There's also part of my work that I care about deeply, which I won't be focusing on much today, which has to do with cultural memory in the aftermath of injustice. And Dean Kessie spoke a little bit about that work. I've looked at various kinds of genre, testimony, life narrative, art, performance art, museum practice even, and even forms of protest in which some imaginative work goes into inviting us all to care about the past as it shows up in the present. And there's a manuscript that hopefully will see the light of day soon, along with an edited collection in which my colleague Roseanne Kennedy and I have looked at, we've called it feminism, memory, activism, looking at how feminist practitioners work with, how they use their creative work in order to invoke memory to advocate for more just futures. Okay, this just gives you a little sense of the kinds of work that I've produced in the past, looking at the life narrative of activists like Ruth First and Emma Mashinini. More recently, looking at the form that protest takes, also on this campus, as activists draw attention to injustice in the here and now, and the form that takes. But let me start by my first book and the kind of work that I sought to do in that book, which is called The Early Modern Global South in Print, Textual Form and the Production of Human Difference as Knowledge. And it's a bit of a mouthful, and I wish that I had called it something different. However, what it was trying to do was examining carefully these geographies, maps, natural histories, in which what I saw is that the southern parts of the world got spoken about in very particular ways, and equivalences got set up. There was a whole racialization of the South as part of the explanation for why the North was ascendant. And that became produced as truth, but one has to look at how that happens on the page, and the kinds of knowledge practices, the textual devices that would try to persuade readers that this is truth as opposed to argument. But of course, they are very much involved in the work of argument. And it meant that I got to look at books, huge, big tomes like this that are 500 years old. This is Sebastian Münster's Cosmographia Universalis from 1544, but it was translated into many different languages, and it sought to offer an encyclopedic look at the whole world, which now, of course, had this fourth part, and try to convince the readers that what was being produced was truth. But of course, if you look at it really carefully, if you go into the archive and if you read these pages, you can see how even something like woodcuts that get used to kind of illustrate regions of the world that are being described were produced and reproduced to illustrate areas that were as disparate as Asia and what is now known as South America and Africa. These woodcuts just get reproduced. They appear again and again. And I looked at the language that they used, which tried to create an argument for why the so-called northern people, through an understanding of the effect of climate, the northern people are set up as robust, full of valor and animosity. They're strong, they've always been victorious. And so that's why the northern people dominate the southern people of the world. But of course, one can see there that it's very much an argument and that it's smoke and mirrors. It's highly partisan. And in producing this work, I sought to intervene or to make a contribution to debates in my field in early modern studies at a time when there was a lot of anxiety about talking about race in early modern studies, because of course the word race was used quite differently in the 16th and 17th century. It meant something different. But what it meant, but when scholars say, well, you can't use the word race to talk about the 16th and 17th century, what that meant was that people were being silenced from discussing what we know to be racism and the operations of racism. So we needed to find some language to be able to think about the way that racism was operating at that time and the different forms that it took. When I looked at the way that Africa was being represented at this time, and this, in fact, is a little detail of that large map by Martin Walsiemüller from 1507 that I had as my little icon picture in the first slide. I meant to draw attention to it. You can see Africa is being produced as the kind of dark continent that has wild animals and wild peoples as part of it. And my interest in the representation of the way that Africa was being constructed as knowable, able to be known within this kind of system of knowledge at the time in modern geography. What was quite clear is that the work of the editors, the packaging of these texts made an enormous difference on what landed. So, for example, this geography, a geographical history of Africa, which was edited and packaged and translated, shaped by the English scholar John Pori in 1600, of a man he called Leo Africanus, and described in words that were not in the original describe Leo Africanus as the Moor and as the Mohammedan, language that really wasn't there in the original in 1526, by in a text that was written by Johanna al-Sad, whose name was anglicized in this fashion, and he ended up being presented as this kind of go-between between different worlds. So the work of careful textual analysis allowed me to dislodge some of the so-called truths about a figure like Leo Africanus and about the Africa that was being presented in those pages. What is really interesting about this particular text is that scholars have understood it to be the inspiration for Othello, which was written a couple of years after 1600 when this appeared. People say that Shakespeare read this, and of course Othello is also someone who moves between worlds, who is this renowned general in Venice, but also has this kind of self-doubt which makes him vulnerable to the manipulations of Iago, and so ends up becoming this caricature of the jealous black man who murders. And scholars have found this a very troubling text. But the other thing to say about this figure of Othello is that, of course, he only ever comes into being in performance, truly. And I began more and more in my work, as my work started grappling with Shakespeare, you know, and his work as an early modernist, I found myself thinking more and more about performance as the moment where these plays truly come into being. And of course, things can be performed in many, many different ways. And increasingly, as I started taking seriously the aspect of Shakespeare's work that had to do with performance, I began to look at how Shakespeare's work has been taken up and adapted and reimagined in different contexts around the world. So this is a great example, a film by the renowned Indian director Vishal Bhardwaj, who is very enamored of Shakespeare, loves Shakespeare, but his form of homage is to adapt the work and imagine. So this is the Hamlet story set in Kashmir in the 1990s, just after the notorious AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, when the Indian Army had powers to gather up suspected dissidents and detain them without trial. And I mean, we see that the situation in Kashmir is far from resolved even today. And so a work like this moves beyond that idea of Hamlet as, you know, locked into this vortex of Oedipal angst in this, you know, this very much just within the family. The way in which Bhardwaj reimagined this in Kashmir, we get to see the politics that actually lies at the heart of Hamlet. In fact, the dispossession, the sense of injustice, and the need for vengeance. And I've spoken about this performance history of Hamlet, in which from the middle of the 20th century, when Laurence Olivier discovered Freud and the Oedipal complex and created a film in which it was all about this sexual tension between him and his mother. And, you know, Laurence Olivier was 40. The woman cast as his mother, Gertrude, was 27. And there were lots of these sort of close-ups of the bed and so on. And so that became the dominant way of understanding what Hamlet meant. And we've moved far from Shakespeare now, although even in, you know, the text might be virtually the same. So there's a way in which when Hamlet travels, he gains new meanings. The film, the work itself comes to be understood in different ways. I need to move on because I've got a lot to tell you. So my second book looked at contemporary adaptations and the innovations that have revitalized Shakespeare. And when increasingly, of course, this also involved the issue of social justice. And when Chris and I were thinking about how to frame, how to create a focus for an international conference on Shakespeare in 2019, we both very quickly identified this issue of Shakespeare and social justice as really being an area that we trusted our colleagues would find compelling, and they did. We were so gratified to find how many colleagues sought to come and then President of the Shakespeare Association of America, Ayanna Thompson, honored us as the keynote speaker, and many produced work that we were able to put together in an edited collection on global Shakespeare and social injustice, and another co-edited special issue of the Shakespeare Bulletin on Shakespeare and social justice in contemporary performance, which I co-edited with a wonderful colleague, David Sterling Brown, in Trinity College in the States. So there's a lot of interest in the scholars are really grappling with exactly these things. More recent work that I found myself being drawn to is thinking about contemporary adaptations of Macbeth that get located in Africa, for better and also in a sense for worse, because it's all too easy to think of a Macbeth in Africa as, you know, primitivist and savage and wild, and there were some real problems with some of these adaptations and others that were done much more thoughtfully and self-critically. The question of adaptation, of course, or just reimagining and the kinds of staging choices that go into a performance of any given play was also at the forefront when thinking about The Tempest, and I found myself returning to The Tempest again and again. This is a staging that was done in partnership with the Royal Shakespeare Company and the Baxter, in which you can see that the Caliban figure, and I will talk a little bit in a bit more detail about The Tempest in a moment, just for those who might not know the play, Caliban the colonized, who is in some historical versions treated as, you know, bestial, half human, half fish, a figure that is much maligned. To have John Carney, doyen of South African theatre, playing Caliban, I mean, he inspires outrage before he has even spoken a word, this kind of Madiba figure, this irascible Prospero, the colonizer, played by Anthony Sher. There was a sense in which they were very conscious of the post-TRC moment and the giving and receiving of forgiveness. There are ways in which this production was inspired by the new South African moment, but also took on, I would think, quite uncritically, the racial stratification of South African society. But the thing about The Tempest is that it has meant so many different things and been interpreted in so many different ways over the centuries of its life, where Prospero used to be thought of as the kind of perfect, almost like a spokesperson for Shakespeare himself, as this figure of civilization and the good arts, and Caliban as a figure of, you know, savagery. And yet, the independence movements in the Caribbean and in Africa in the 20th century meant that that this was being overturned actually, and that new perspectives on the Tempest were being offered. It became possible to recognize the play's real interest in the injustice of colonial domination. And in this work, I was honored to be invited by Ayanna Thompson to write an essay for her collection on Shakespeare and race, and to think about how post-colonial approaches have enriched Shakespeare's work. And in a sense, the question that lay at the heart of this, as I ask towards the end of the piece, is that when we do the work of interpretation, there's a question to ask in the scene of colonial conquest. Are you on the boat? Do you identify with the Europeans who arrive? Or are you on the shore? And that it is legitimate, in fact, to do that question about, to make a choice about whose perspective you give attention to. And this is a question that was inspired by the historian Laurent Desbois, who quotes Jean Casimir, the Haitian intellectual, who thinks that history actually, quite rightly, needs to be that these questions of partisan interests are legitimate in the writing of history. And I think so too in relation to theatre practice. And the aim of this particular handbook was to try and equip students with the tools, the critical tools that they need to be able to ask hard questions of the works that they're studying, and not to be thinking about what is the right answer, like what is the one right interpretation, what did Shakespeare mean? What did he intend for us to mean? That becomes a less relevant question and completely unhelpful question, an impossible question to answer in any event. But to empower students to think critically about their own interpretive journeys was part of what we were thinking about. But this led me to think about the way in which the Tempest had been interpreted and thought about and understood years before the independence movements in Africa. It's the play that deals most explicitly with the phenomenon of slavery. So how was it played? How was it performed in those years when slavery was practiced for the 250 years or so of its life? How were the slave figures brought into the theatre space? How were the audience invited? What were they invited to see about the problem of slavery? And so began my next project. You can see here that attitudes towards Caliban as the enslaved figure began to shift as the abolition movement gained momentum. And these are some images I found in the archive, where you can see in the space of just a few short years, Caliban moved from being imagined as this bestial creature to being recognized as a human who was unjustly saddled with the burden of labor and coercive labor. And so I began a new book project, and this was part of my sabbatical last year. And it's going to look like this. Many of these chapters are written, but only in part, and it's about reckoning with slavery and the work of, and using the Tempest and the performance history of the Tempest and the ways in which it's been adapted over time to think about the way that the space of the theatre allows us to sort of enters the public imagination and becomes a space of reckoning. And I'm grateful to the Folger Shakespeare Library for a long-term fellowship last year, which supported this work. The thing that I wanted, that I was so astonished by as I began to do this archival work, was to recognize that, in fact, during the years where slavery was practiced, Shakespeare's The Tempest was never performed. And even though The Tempest was a very popular, much performed play, it was an adaptation that removed from sight the enslaved characters, that it was thought of as too old-fashioned a work, Shakespeare's one, to be really worth performing. And so John Dryden and William Davin created a new version in which they imagined more nubile young women. They had this conceit that there was a man called Hippolyta who they imagined audiences would believe had grown up on the island but had never been seen by these women, by these young women. And it became about heterosexual coupling of the white inhabitants of the island. And the conceit was that these young women had never before seen a man, but they had grown up with Caliban. So Caliban, of course, moves out of sight as a figure of human interest. He becomes someone who is not a man, and it became a matter of entertainment. It even went to, there was a performance of an opera, and you can see in the lyrics that are imagined in this opera, in tender sighs. It's all about seduction. In tender sighs, his silence breaks. The fair his flame approves. Consenting blushes warm her cheeks. She smiles. She yields. She loves. And so it's about sex, essentially. And the titillating idea is that these supposed innocents in this Garden of Eden don't understand about sex, but they have these impulses that need to be guided, and they have to find the right mate. So it was a much enjoyed, a much loved production, adaptation, but we didn't see enslavement in that production. And it was only in, now listen to these dates, it was only in 1838 that this operatic version was put aside in favor of a return to Shakespeare's. There was a bold staging in the Covent Garden by William Charles Macready, and let me just mention here that it is 5 years, just 5 years after the Abolition of Slavery Act of 1833 is passed by the British Parliament, abolishing slavery in all British territories. So just this astonishing alignment, which suggests that it was only after slavery had been abolished that it became possible to engage, well, that Shakespeare's play was performed again. And Caliban undergoes this transformation. He's imagined, this is Charles Keane's drawings, as someone burdened with carrying wood and so on. But of course, and he also it becomes possible to, as Samuel Taylor Coleridge spoke of it, think of Caliban with the sympathetic imagination rather than just as an object of scorn. Soon after that, though, a dominant set of ideas came with Darwin's publication of The Origins of the Species, which had a notable impact on who Caliban could be understood to be. And serious Shakespeare scholars wrote, a text like this, Caliban, the Missing Link, which gained traction for a while. But what was interesting, that what accompanied this is a new sense that Caliban was actually an interesting character to play. Here's a letter to Charles Keane from a colleague of his who said that the finest poetry in the play is Caliban's, and that every word he says is capable of being effective in the mouth of even of a great idiot. So, so for a serious-minded actor who wants to create a reputation, Caliban is the part to choose. Anyway, so be it. This work also looks at later periods. So this is a community masque in New York in 1916, in which the Tempest is reimagined as a sort of a pageant that celebrates the multitudes who have arrived in New York. But so it becomes a kind of a celebration of immigration, but also with some problematic effects. And I'm not going to talk about that so much now, because I want to just end with some more recent adaptations and the way in which the Tempest has been a fruitful work to think through the histories that almost can't be really. There is no archive that will give an articulation of, that will give expression to, that will allow us to understand more about the lives lost in the Middle Passage, and that Black feminist scholars and creative artists have found in the figure of Caliban's mother, this sort of Sycorax, this figure of sorcery in the play, some would say, but actually have found in her a really richly imaginative figure to think through the lives lost in the Middle Passage, and the figure of the wise Black woman who is maligned and treated as a source of in fact, of power that makes people afraid. And so, in fact, the image that I have here is of an extraordinary work, an installation that was on at the Museum of African Art in DC while we were there last year, Ayanna Jackson's From the Deep in the Wake of Drexciya, in which, and in fact, much of it was filmed off our coastline, in which she imagines the spirit of the drowned enslaved women, and it's confronting. There's the imaginative work that goes into these creative installations that invite us into a confrontation with this very dark and troubling history that has, in a sense, hardly been reckoned with. So it's interesting to me that the Tempest becomes a space where some of this work, some of these artists find some value for exploring. And it seems that the field of global Shakespeare has developed new ways of thinking about the impact of Shakespeare as his work has been taken up around the world in far-flung places. But the thing is that these old assumptions that linger, about Shakespeare's universalism and his genius and his ongoing relevance for all time, as if he speaks for all people, for all times, in all places, because of this astonishing work of his. And I don't mean to suggest that his work is not incredibly powerful, but there's this cliche about who it is that Shakespeare is understood to be that completely ignores the way in which he's being renewed and reimagined and revitalized by contemporary creative artists and theatre practitioners. And it seems that the field of Shakespeare scholarship really needs to go beyond its traditional ambit if it's really going to be able to be fully open to the impact of this, to unlearn the habits that come with privilege, and to recognize how this most canonical of fields is implicated in those histories. And it feels to me that now more than ever, the field is needing to develop the kinds of tools that will be able to recognize the impact of a creative practice that takes no prisoners in its advocacy. And some of these tools might be to unlearn privilege and to learn to listen with care to the works of creative artists. And this was my argument at a plenary at the Shakespeare Association of America earlier this year, in which, you know, it was so gratifying that the organization chose a panel like the one that my colleague Christina Bolt and I had put together, that was really interested in this radical creative practice of refusing, reducing, reusing, repurposing Shakespeare, riffing off Shakespeare, hijacking Shakespeare in order to tell new stories. And the example that I used, and I'm going to end with this example because I think it really gets to the heart of what I'm trying to offer you today, and that is Madeleine Syatt's work, her performance piece, Where We Belong, in which she tells the story of her relationship to the Tempest as a Mohican woman, theatre maker, who found a great love of Shakespeare as a young person growing up, and was very excited to produce it, particularly The Tempest, because she thought she kept on seeing these works, this work being misunderstood and Caliban being misunderstood. She says in her description of her journey with this that Caliban is indigenous. Don't they get that? He's me. And she feels this deep attachment to doing the play correctly. But what she finds is that both the theatre industry and the world of the academy in the UK, where she goes to do a PhD, begin to treat her as a kind of native informant, as a figure who is going to unlock the primitive in the play. And so she finds herself becoming increasingly alienated. But the work itself, as a work of performance, is just an astonishing approach to storytelling, in which she draws into this kind of healing circle on stage the Mohican spirits of her ancestors, almost as living interlocutors. And in doing so, she invites us to care about her people's experience of dispossession and of being misunderstood, and of losing language. And so the play proposes a new way of being with Shakespeare, and a new way of, and the Tempest in particular gets conscripted into this. She confronts her audiences with their own, and I'm going to say our own, because I went to see this a couple of times and felt deeply affected by my own limited understanding and my own, there was something that she unlocked for me, because she confronts her audiences with their internalized system of value. Because it's almost as if our presence in the theatre and our willingness to listen at all, she suggested, it's because she's made Shakespeare part of the story. She says, I will show you how our stories, and she's talking here about Mohican stories, can change how you see the world, can heal you. Yes, now I could try to show you with Shakespeare, but because that's what you want, isn't it? It's Shakespeare that you want. But as a result, you're blind and deaf to the stories of my people and the ways in which we have lost our language and our place in the world. And so she says, and one last anecdote about this, and then I'll end. She talks about the fact that she gives an astonishing experience of going into the British Museum, into their American archive, and she walks in, and she describes the distress at hearing the howling of the spirits of the ancestors who are in this room where this tone-deaf British academic is just showing artifacts, and asks about whether they're going to be repatriated and when and what, you know, there's this tremendous sense of distress. And she says they always can repatriate. You just have to decide it's okay to let go, to hold on less tightly, to release what isn't yours, to listen, to care. And so taking a lead from Said's play, then I'd like to end by affirming that it might be precisely this kind of careful listening that has the potential to bring about a shift in the academy. We are invited to set aside our scholarly training in Shakespeare, if we can, and listen with care and attention and self-awareness, however surprising the meaning, as these plays are being repurposed to address the concerns of a new generation. My last couple of words that I would like to say, if I may, is just an enormous thank you. Firstly, to my beautiful colleagues who are all sitting here in their gorgeousness, who have created a space in which I feel that my work is challenged and inspired and supported. I think I have the best department, honestly, of beautiful, supportive, interesting, committed scholars whose work from this place has allowed my own also to flourish. I have a beautiful, beloved, extended, blended family. My brother is here too, my dad and his wife, sort of my own family, and I feel very grateful. And I would like to thank these beautiful people, my gang, who challenged me too, as you heard, when Luke says, why Shakespeare? They take me into wild, beautiful mountain spaces, on runs, on pathways, and allow me to feel grounded and loved and well and renewed. And I have to say, they read my work too. Nothing gets sent out into the world that hasn't passed Rolf's eye for clarity and also a strong sense of purpose, a gift of tremendous love. And so thank you, beautiful people, and thank you all. There's one more thing that I wanted to say, and that is, you know, so many of us struggle with this work-life balance, with the contest between our work that is so important and rewarding and our family life. And I've come to see it differently. I've come to see that, in fact, there is no contest, that the fact that I get to go home and feel renewed and well means that I get to be a much better teacher and scholar. And the fact that I get to come and do this work that I find so immensely rewarding, work with my students and my scholarly work, means I think that I'm a much better parent and partner and just well in the world. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Young, for that riveting lecture. It's now time to invite Professor Chris Thurman to give a few words. And Chris Thurman is professor in the English department and founding director of the Tikinya Chaka Center, School of Literature, Language and Media at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And he has been president of the Shakespeare Society of Southern Africa for many years and was editor of the journal Shakespeare in Southern Africa for over a decade until recently. So please welcome Professor Shakespeare to the stage. Chris, I don't know if you want to put this somewhere. Yeah.
What's that? Is that okay? Good evening, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is for me to stand here, although I feel slightly insecure. One really never wants to follow one's brilliant colleagues because feels whatever you might say is not quite appropriate. But I have a few words that I'd like to share. Please forgive my phone. It will help me to keep time. And I've also added a few notes to self while Sandy was speaking. Nowadays, you can never be sure if somebody's on their phone during a lecture, if they're diligently making notes, or if they're doing what they shouldn't be doing. So my first two notes are Maynardville and Mr. Shakespeare. Maybe I should address the Mr. Shakespeare first. There are two reasons why I can't be Mr. Shakespeare, and why, in fact, Sandy and I would both avoid Mr., Ms., Mrs., Prof Shakespeare, because as you would have seen from Sandy's talk, I hope you don't mind the informality of Sandy, I won't say Professor Young. We're in this paradoxical position that we're constantly talking ourselves in a way out of a job, because we seek to undermine Shakespeare's authority precisely because of the historical baggage that it carries and the power that has unfortunately been wielded by and through it. And at the same time, in a sense, our scholarly projects depend very heavily on that authority. So it's a real, it's a productive wrestle or tussle for us. But that's partly why we might resist being Mr. or Ms. or Mrs. Shakespeare. But the other reason, of course, is that South African Shakespeareans like me, like Dr. Asna Musa, who's with us here this evening as well, and others, all labour, and I should say labour very happily, but nonetheless labour in Sandy's wake as a Shakespeare scholar. She is ahead of us, and I'll be talking a little bit about that with a few anecdotes of my own. So my role here tonight is to give thanks and to respond to what we've heard. I'm going to try to say a few words about my representative role in giving thanks to Sandy for her words. And along the way, as I discuss the different communities or demographics that I represent, I'm going to weave in some comments on the wonderful lecture that she has presented to us. So I suppose it's worth mentioning that Sandy and I first met in the arts block when she had just come back from her PhD and then I think postdoctoral studies in North America, and I was still laboring on my PhD. And we didn't spend too much time getting to know each other. We sort of passed by each other in the corridors. But after a few years, I ended up at Wits, and Sandy and I began to correspond and to work together. And I had the privilege of participating in a very modest editorial role in one or two of her publications. And so this led to a kind of exchange of ideas and a developing friendship, and we would often exchange notes as we sort of took on different roles in our respective departments about the historical antagonism between Wits and UCT. And indeed the antagonism that seems to, for decades, unnecessarily have been, well, not necessarily, perhaps inevitably, been part and parcel of English department life in departments around the country and indeed the world, which is the stuff of various campus novels, as many of you will know. But although it might be the case that historically people would look from the Literary Studies Academy at the UCT English department with perhaps some envy, perhaps low-key resentment, it is important to say, for those of you who are not part of the UCT community, that in recent years, it is with a tremendous sense of admiration and the healthiest of envy that we look to the UCT English department now from other universities. And Prof Kessie has alluded to Sandy's role in this as head of department and as a member of the department over the years. And I want to say, Sandy, that you have, with your colleagues, navigated very important and difficult conversations about race, gender, privilege, curriculum. And as a head of department and as a member of department, you've been exemplary in the fullest sense. So it's in that sense that in that capacity as a literary studies scholar in South Africa, that I first and foremost have to say thank you to you. Especially perhaps those of us in the academy who are white and trying to figure out how best to exercise allyship without recentering ourselves in the wider project of transformation. So it is indeed on that score that we owe you a great debt of thanks. That's a very niche we. Perhaps an even more niche we, a narrower demographic, is South African Shakespeareans and early modernists. And as I've suggested, Sandy leads our field here. So often one finds oneself citing Sandy, spurred by her, inspired by her. Now, this, of course, has its downsides. In fact, just this week, and this is an accurate and true anecdote, you must trust me that it is faithful. I was working on a funding application. And as happens when you work on a funding application, you have to demonstrate familiarity with the field, but also make the claim that nobody has ever done what you would like to pursue. And I was working with a couple of colleagues in the UK around the idea of the oceanic humanities as applied to Shakespeare studies and Shakespearean performance in particular, thinking about the literal imagination, the literal zone where land meets sea. And I sort of put in, this has hardly been explored or pursued except by Young, brackets 2019. I thought that's enough, kind of acknowledged that somebody else did it. And I thought, I better be honest. And so I put into my bibliography all of the work that Sandy has done in this really imaginatively productive and important, let's call it the literal zone, not just with her Shakespeare in the Global South book from 2019, but also, as you would have seen in the Cambridge Companion piece, where she quotes that important question, are you on the boat or on the shore? And I realized I had to jettison the entire application because really Sandy had actually covered this terrain in her work, and so it's important, to kind of flag that the intellectual leadership that she offers to us as South African Shakespeareans and indeed Shakespeareans of the Global South. That applies also in our teaching roles. So, for example, a few years ago, I was teaching Heder at Wits, and it was very convenient for me to be able to, once again, point my students to the South African scholar Sandy Young, who'd written on the work, and it was really one of the most important and early critical voices to affirm the tremendous insights that are generated by that adaptation, but also to note that Sandy is unashamed in her subtitle in that piece, which finds its way into her book as well, to talk about the pain of the Kashmiri people. And you would have seen at the end as well that Sandy does not shy away from these important ethical interpersonal questions. So often as academics and scholars, we speak in a slightly abstracted, distant sense about social problems. We speak in generalities rather than thinking about individuals who are suffering. And that too is a very important cue for us as Shakespeare scholars in South Africa. Of course, Sandy's work as an academic citizen has been alluded to as well. It's been some of my happiest work as a scholar to co-organize conferences and co-edit books with Sandy. But it's also worth mentioning that the Shakespeare Society of Southern Africa's conferences, the last two iterations, have been made possible precisely because of Sandy's reputation and status in the global Shakespeare Academy. When people come to South Africa to be keynote speakers, it's because they have encountered Sandy's work in print, because they've heard her speak at conferences. And so there's a sense in which not only she represents South Africa to the Global Academy, but also I can stand here representing a different community, which is Shakespeare scholars from around the world, on whose behalf, once again, Sandy, I am happy to thank you. It seems, it's embarrassing and bizarre, in fact, to think that in the mid 20s or the 2015 or so, there was still a reluctance, particularly in the powerful North American Shakespeare Academy, to talk about race. And so Sandy has been a leader in that sense, thinking about transatlantic histories and Indian Ocean histories and their present day connections as well. never shying away from this commitment to show social justice, which leads us, of course, to today's topic. So just a few pointers or points from today's talk that grabbed my attention. You think you know a field, and then you listen to Sandy speak and you realize that there's so much more to explore and pursue. The image that I wanted to leave with you, or one of them, is the idea of breaking the frame. You would have seen from the Waldseemüller map that Sandy pointed to, the tip of Africa causes a little dent in the frame. And for map makers of the period, the question of how to represent the southern extent of Africa was important, and it depended who you were making the map for. If you were trying to discourage navigation from Europe to the southern tip and perhaps around the southern tip of Africa, you would want to indicate that it was really, really far away. But you also had to try and sort of gesture towards appropriate ratios in terms of distance. And so this curious contrivance of the bent frame that accommodates the southern tip of Africa appears in a couple of maps of the period. But this seemed to me really productive and constructive way for us to be able to boast as South Africans about our southern positioning and the insights that generates for the world. But specifically in terms of Sandy's work, to think about breaking the frame, changing the assumptions that we have, the paradigms that so often operate. And of course, when we speak as a we, I suppose we tend to then we're thinking about a global scholarly field. But perhaps the stronger we is the we of the global South, post-colonial scholars who have not shied away from talking about historical injustice and race, and have always found that kind of central and necessary as a driver of our work. I wanted also to mention the very gratifying connection between Sandy's earlier work and, in fact, ongoing work on cultural memory in a South African context, whether that's thinking about the TRC or other forms of testimonial and heritage and recognition of past and ongoing injustices, particularly slavery, and to connect that to these wonderful final images that she showed us and the idea of an underwater archive, thinking about the Tempest as presenting and the theatrical material for conceptualizing an underwater archive. Many of you will know in that play, of course, there is the beautiful mourning song about a father lost beneath the ocean, full fathom fire for thy father lies. And so what Sandy offers here is an opportunity for theatre makers to think about songs like that as staged moments of recognition of those lost in the transatlantic passage, for example, and to try and sort of bring to the surface these buried oceanic archives. I thought that what Sandy had to tell us about the effacement of Caliban during the period of slavery after the Tempest was first performed and until the technical abolition of slavery. That's absolutely fascinating, and that's not a correlation or overlap with which, well, once Shakespeare scholars are aware of the Dryden and Davenant adaptation, but for Sandy to kind of identify those historical correlations is fascinating, and I think it says so much about the ways in which not only historical but present injustice is sublimated or ushered gently off stage, and it's a deeply troubling but very rich observation that Sandy has given to us then. And finally, just to close on the point about the consequence of this history of misrepresentation, particularly around the figure of Caliban in the Tempest. I love that Sandy places then an ethical burden on us as scholars, on you as audience members, and particularly on theatre makers to do something about that misrepresentation and to be aware of the implications of the choices of representation on stage or screen. And so it might be worth closing with a bit of advertising. Next year's main novel production is The Tempest. And if they are not watching online, I'm assuming they're not in the audience, they might be. Those who are part of the creative team for that production, I'm sure will thrill at the opportunity to apply, test out some of the ideas that Sandy has shared with us. So wherever the camera is, if you're watching this recording, think about what we can do with and through The Tempest in a South African context in 2025. But thank you all very much. And Sandy, I don't think I've really done justice to what you've shared with us. My sincere thanks.
Thank you, Professor Thurman, and thank you to all of you again for being with us this evening. As we bring this evening's thought-provoking lecture to a close, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Sandra Young for taking us on such a profound journey. Her exploration of literature's role in addressing social justice challenges has opened up new ways of thinking about the power of imagination in shaping our understanding of history and its ongoing impacts on the present. And we're truly fortunate to have witnessed such insightful scholarship here tonight, and I'm certain that Professor Young's work will continue to inspire important conversations across disciplines and beyond. So before we conclude, I would like to invite you all to join us for some refreshments just outside here in the foyer, where we can continue these conversations in a more informal setting. I'll ask you to just allow us to leave the room first, the platform party, and thank you once again for being here this evening, and please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks.